Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session in the second year of the Disability and Arts webinar series. We are thrilled that you've chosen to spend the afternoon with us. My name is Amanda Noyes, and I am the Arts and Education Accessibility Director for the South Carolina Arts Commission. My pronouns are she and her. I am a white female in my mid-30s with brown hair. I'm wearing a white shirt and blue jumpsuit today. The mission of the South Carolina Arts Commission is to promote equitable access to the arts and to support the cultivation of creativity in South Carolina. We are seeking to meet that mission in part through our partnership with Able South Carolina. We know that we can't have equitable access to the arts if arts programs and facilities are not accessible. About 2 years ago, SCAC launched our Arts for All SC grant, which was our first large-scale effort to support arts organizations who desired to work towards being more accessible. Since that launch, our partnership with Able South Carolina has grown, and we're now working collaboratively to support arts organizations across the state in their accessibility journeys. If you are an arts organization in South Carolina, and are not sure where to begin or feel like you need additional support or assistance in your accessibility work, please feel free to contact me and our friends over at Able. We would really love to speak with you. Able is here with us today to share about ways that we can better engage and include youth with disabilities in our arts programs. I'm so excited for today's webinar and hope you find the information helpful. I also invite you to attend our website reflection hour scheduled for tomorrow, February 6th from 3 to 4. This is an open time to come and continue the conversation. Feel free to bring questions that may arise from our discussion today. And now I'm going to hand it over to Troy and Michael to get us started. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. Today we are going to be talking about the best ways to engage and include youth with disabilities as you are structuring your programs throughout the year, during the summer. I know a lot of people in here have taken advantage of a lot of these other sessions. Hopefully your knowledge about how to include people with disabilities has really grown. So we are going to talk about a few different practical strategies that I think you're really going to find useful, but we're going to do a quick introduction first. So if we can go to that next slide. So hi, everyone. My name is Troy Hall. I'm a white male with glasses and brown hair. I'm wearing a blue button-up shirt today. My pronouns are he, him. I am the Director of Youth Transition Programs here at Able South Carolina. And I'm going to pass it over to my friend Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Hanna. I'm a middle-aged white male with a giant beard, and the picture on the screen, my beard's a bit smaller. I also wear glasses. I'm the Senior Youth Programs Coordinator here at Able South Carolina. I'm going to pass it back to Troy.
All right. So some of you may already be familiar, but if you're not, Able South Carolina, we are a disability-led organization seeking transformational changes in systems, communities, and individuals. We are one of the oldest and largest federally recognized disability-led organizations in South Carolina. What's really unique about Able South Carolina is that over 75% of the people that work here and over half of our board are people with disabilities. We can go to that next slide. So our whole mission is to equip, educate, and advocate. So we want to make sure that people with disabilities have all the tools they need to foster disability pride and direct their own lives. We do a lot of work to educate communities, so whether that's schools, churches, businesses. We want to make sure that people are following the law as it's written and removing all of these barriers of accessibility that are kind of baked into systems. And then we do advocacy. So we do this on big levels and small levels. We were instrumental in getting some really important laws passed, helping end subminimum wage in our state, securing parental rights for people with disabilities, But then Michael and I also are able to do a lot of smaller kind of one-on-one work with schools, administration, and youth all throughout the state to make sure that they have the skills to advocate for the changes they want in their own lives. Go to that next slide. So on this slide, you can see a picture of a lot of our staff. We've actually grown quite a bit since this picture, if you can believe it. But there are several individuals all wearing matching kind of powder blue t-shirts that are standing on the Capitol steps at one of our events, our Advocacy Day for Access and Independent events. Ooh, that one's a mouthful. And our whole goal at Able South Carolina is we want to be that national model for accessibility, equity, and inclusion for all people with disabilities in the state. Let's keep going. So today, what we'd really like to do is we want to talk with you about some laws that might be relevant as you are setting up your classrooms and your programs regarding accessibility, and then give everyone a lot of very practical tips and strategies that you can implement uniquely within the environment that you're in. So in the classroom, in the studio, wherever you are. Let's go to that next slide. So I would love to just kind of start. I'm going to open up the chat here too. I know you guys have been through a couple of other webinars. You've talked about a lot of these topics. What are some things that you have heard about youth with disabilities, about students? So on the screen, you can see a photo of a young woman holding a poster, and on that poster, it's got some examples like people with ADHD can't focus, or people with autism have special talents. What are some things that y'all have heard either parents or families or youth themselves or other teachers say? And Michael, have you heard of anything you want to throw out to get us started too?
Yeah, so we have two examples on there. People with ADHD can't focus. I've heard that one a lot in my life, Troy, since I have ADHD. And people with autism have special talents. We might hear that someone who uses a wheelchair may not be able to do a sport. We're getting examples in the chat now. Karina said people who are blind cannot make visual art. And Rachel said people who are deaf don't enjoy music.
Yeah, absolutely. Teachers say they don't feel like they know how to work with students with disabilities. Yeah, all excellent examples. And we know that this kind of stuff isn't true. And for teachers especially, I know sometimes it can feel like you need to have all of this really unique, really specialized, high-tech, advanced knowledge in order to do anything. And while all of those kind of skills are very useful, the things that we're going to be talking about today are really going to be pretty straightforward. They're based a lot on the experience that we've had running programs, the successes that we've had, the failures that we've learned from. So everything should be, yeah, pretty straightforward. Art is therapy for people with disabilities, not a job. Oh yeah, wow, that's a big one. To start us off, oh, you guys are killing it with these examples. This is wonderful. Yeah, please keep those coming. That's going to help us focus some of our conversational topics too. I'm going to ask Michael to kick us off. He's going to sort of talk about some of the laws that I want us to be somewhat familiar with and keep in the back of our mind as we go over some of these tips.
Thank you, Troy. Yeah, so we're going to talk about some laws to keep in mind. A quick disclaimer, we are not lawyers, but these are laws that we encounter regularly in our work throughout the school year and when we're running summer programs. And so these are ones that are important to keep in mind when you're working with youth. Let's go to the next slide real quick. Okay, the big one, I'm sure y'all have heard about it. We're going to cover it again here, is the Americans with Disability Act, also known as the ADA. On the picture here, we have the president signing it into law on the lawn. It covers most summer programs. So In general, if you're running a summer program, it is probably covered by the Americans with Disability Act. This includes private camps, nonprofit programs, recreational activities, especially if it's open to the public. It does not cover religious organizations running programs. They're technically exempt from ADA Title III. Still a really great law to reference, though, if you're trying to make things accessible. Key impact programs must provide equal access, reasonable modifications, effective communication, even if they don't receive federal funds. So this law really focuses on making sure that everyone's able to participate in the camp that you're running. Let's go to the next one. One similar to the ADA, but actually came before it, is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. In this picture, we actually have a picture of a sit-in that was a protest that was done in order to make sure that the Rehab Act of 1973 actually got implemented. This covers any summer program that receives federal funding. So where the ADA covers most things, the Rehab Act specifically is talking about programs with federal funding. So that includes public schools, universities, organizations that get federal grants. It does not cover privately run camps or programs without federal assistance. So if a summer program falls under 504, it must provide reasonable accommodations to participants with disabilities. So think accessible facilities, communication aids, modifications for participation, just making adjustments to make sure that every single one of our campers can be a part of all of the activities. Let's go to the next one. Okay, a couple other ones that we may not think about when it comes to camps, but are important to keep in mind: the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This covers public school programs, including an extended year or extended school year or ESY services, or any summer program run by a public school district. Does not cover private summer camps, nonprofit programs, or community-based summer programs unless a public school runs them or you're doing it in partnership with a public school and their teachers or staff are involved. Then this is one that we want to keep in mind. Essentially, if students qualify for the extended year, extended school year, their school must provide special education services outlined in their IEP. So you may have to set up some MOUs or agreements with the school if you're doing it in partnership with them, so you can also make sure their IEPs are being met. Let's go to the next one. All right, sticking with schools is FERPA, or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. If you've worked with youth in schools, you've heard of this before. FERPA applies if the summer program is affiliated with a public school or educational institution that receives federal funding. This law protects the privacy of students' education records. It covers summer camps run by public schools, universities, or other federally funded educational institutions. If you're a private camp or community program that is not connected to schools or federal funding, you may not be covered by this. And then key impacts: parents or eligible students 18 years or older must consent before their records are disclosed. Programs must ensure that accommodations or special education records are kept confidential and shared only with authorized personnel. For programs that request medical or behavioral information, following FERPA guidelines for storing and using the information is critical. So this is one where you might get guidance from the school on the steps that they take, or another legal expert in FERPA to make sure you are covering all your bases. Let's go to the next one. Okay, state laws and regulations. State laws can further impact summer programs in areas like accessibility, health and safety, or mandatory reporting. So regulations vary depending on the state that you're in, but there's some common examples. Accessibility: some states expand ADA requirements by enforcing stricter building codes or program accessibility guidelines. Staffing ratios: states must mandate specific staff to youth ratios for summer programs, especially for those serving individuals with disabilities. Mandatory reporting: in most states, program staff are considered mandatory reporters, requiring them to report any suspicions of abuse or neglect. And then health and state safety: states often regulate medical accommodations, such as who can administer medication or perform medical procedures. Think insulin injections, EpiPen use. I know that when we do many of our summer programs, we have nursing staff who assist with managing medications. Something to keep in mind is that even though we're saying the words summer program or camp in here, it applies to any summer activity that you're doing with youth. So changing the name typically does not change the laws that apply to them. Okay. let's head to the next one. All right, so we made this handy little chart that helps figure out which laws exactly apply to which ones. So if your summer program is linked to a public school or receives federal funding, FERPA applies, and you must protect the privacy of education records. Please check your state's specific regulations for additional requirements regarding accessibility, staffing, mandatory reporting, or health accommodations. So we have this chart broken down by type of program. So public school programs, federally funded, private summer camps and community programs, and religious run camps. And then for each law, it either says yes, that it applies, or likely if you're receiving federal funds. So for example, one that might get a little complicated is a religious run camp. If they're receiving federal funds for something, then the 504 would apply. If they're not, then the 504 probably wouldn't apply. Same for the ADA if it's open to the public, even though they're a religious run camp or organization. The IDEA typically would not apply. Again, if they're doing it in a joint program with a local school, then we have to keep that in mind, right? IDEA and FERPA may apply there, but that's not as common. And then state laws and regulations apply to everyone. I believe we're sending this out afterwards, so I'm gonna have us go to the next one.
Michael, it looks like there's a hand up in the chat
Oh,
with a
absolutely.
question.
What's the question?
Meg, I saw your hand up. Do you want to unmute or would you like to type it out in the chat? Never mind. It was an accidental hand raise. Sorry, keep going.
No worries at all. So I'm going to pass it back to Troy, and he is going to walk us through. Okay. Jenna asked, how is receiving federal funds defined? I work in the city of Savannah. My department does not receive federal funds, but other areas of the city do. Would my department need to follow FERPA? That's a great question. So typically, if you are receiving federal funds that apply to, or other areas do, yeah, you're good. Typically, if the funds are being used for that program, or you're primarily funded by federal funds, then you do need to take into account the laws that are affected by federal funds, like 504 and ADA. FERPA should only apply if you're affiliated with a public school or an educational institution that also receives federal funding. So that wording was a little weird in there. I'm glad we're clearing that up while we're talking here. The key, though, would be to, one, look at where the fundings come from and make sure you talk to one of the individuals on your staff or partnered with your agency that can help clarify the exact impact of the laws. But typically, if that funding's coming for the camp from a federal source, we would want to keep in mind 504 and the ADA. NEA is a federal agency. SEAC receives NEA funding. If an institution receives a GOS grant, is that institution's summer programs federally funded? So if they're receiving funding from a federal agency, that would fall under federal funding.
Yeah, these are excellent questions too. And like I said, I believe this presentation is going to be available, so we can have that guide more readily available.
Hey,
But
Troy,
yeah,
yes, we will be sending the presentation out by 5 o'clock Eastern this afternoon.
perfect. Also, just a quick note, we're going to talk about this too in these tips as well. While we obviously always need to follow the laws and regulations that guide us, these sort of accessibility measures are also just best practices. So even if maybe there isn't a specific law that ties you down to very specific needs or accommodations, it really is best practice to try and follow all of these guidelines as much as possible, because obviously none of us are in the business of trying to exclude anyone. What we really want to do is show people that it can actually be easier to make things accessible than you might think. So we have kind of broken down these tips into three big categories. Some things you can do before your event starts, some things you'll be able to do right as your event starts to set the tone, and then things you can do throughout your event. Obviously, if you've already started something, you can still utilize a lot of these tips from any section. But this is just sort of the most logical way we've got them. So let's go ahead to that first tip. Okay, walkthroughs. A walkthrough is just when staff assess the physical event space. So this is usually before the program starts. You've got people who are literally moving from place to place, kind of following the paths that your youth would be following, right? So just kind of imitating what a day might look like so you can actually see what's going on. This really helps identify physical accessibility barriers and other accessibility barriers, and gives you a chance well before the event to start planning alternate routes, different paths, different things you can do. So this is a good practice if we need to follow those ADA requirements for physical accessibility. But then just as a matter of general disability etiquette, we are using this to make sure we are not that people with disabilities are going to have access and we're not singling out anyone. So let's go to the next slide to see how we can actually do it. So a walkthrough is pretty straightforward. It's exactly what it sounds like. This is when you're going to independently navigate the venue that you're in, the space that you're in, and check for barriers. And so a lot of these are going to be very common sense barriers that you're going to think of when you think about disabilities that affect someone's mobility or dexterity, right? So are all the paths you're asking young people to follow, do they have unnecessary steps? Do they have really steep hills, right? If someone's utilizing a wheelchair, they're going to be able to navigate up a hill. So even if you've avoided steps, is this hill actually at an appropriate slope to ask someone in a wheelchair to use? Are the paths you're asking people to go on, are they rough or is everything paved? Is everything smooth? Think about people who might have limited dexterity or issues or disability that affects their mobility or their balance, right? We're going to want to find the smoothest, safest path possible, making sure areas are lit well. So are these poorly lit areas? Or if this camp extends into the evening or at night, is there artificial light to light these paths, right? If someone has a disability that affects their vision or maybe only affects their vision at night, or in these lower light situations, do we have sort of accommodations built in to light these areas? And then some other sort of physical aspects that we might not always think about, but think about the sound in the space where you're in. If you're going to be in a studio, is this a big shared space where there's going to be other people utilizing the space? Is this going to be really difficult for people to concentrate and hear if you're going to be giving instruction? Are there even just going to be machinery sounds or louder sounds or construction or lawn care going on outside? Because that can affect people with specific disabilities for their ability to pay attention, to concentrate, to retain information, to keep their anxiety at a lower level. And then crowds as well. A lot of times we do not have an independent space to host a lot of these programs or to teach these classes. Sometimes it's going to be in a shared space, or even these transitional areas. If you're going from one room to another, it's going to be shared with a lot of other people. How are we able to handle crowds, right? Is there going to be a massive throng of people that is going to be really disruptive? Are you able to time transitions to where you're not running into crowds, right? Are you able to navigate or arrange where you have a space for young people to use that's when it's not shared with other people? Through this walkthrough, we can also talk about things like accessible seating. Do we need to make accommodations for seating? One of the things that we have to do in one of our programs, our youth leadership forum, and Michael was a huge part of doing this initially too, is going out to multiple venues, doing full walkthroughs, and then deciding, you know what, this venue is just going to need so many changes, it's really not going to be accessible. We were lucky enough to be able to find other venues. Even the most accessible venue we found, every time we use it in the summer, they have this wonderful auditorium setup they give us, but we have to ask them to come in and remove seats because they don't have any wheelchair accessibility, right? So, which they can do very easily. All it takes is a phone call. It's 10 minutes, maintenance has it out. But If we hadn't have done this walkthrough, we would have had to figure that out on day one as people were in the classroom. So doing this kind of stuff beforehand is really, really helpful. And then if you are going to have multiple routes, making sure, or if a venue has an accessible route, is that accessible route clearly marked, right? Do people know that this is the route that they need to use? So doing these kind of pre-event walkthroughs can be really, really important. And while we all think, and maybe there's a lot of brilliant people on the call who can kind of mentally go through a space and anticipate all this, for most people, you're really going to have to physically be there and go through that space to think about the challenges that might come up. Let's go to the next one. All right, safety plans. Oh, and by the way, we will definitely have time for questions and discussion, but if it's easier to just ask questions as they come up, please feel free. Safety plans. So safety plans are just emergency plans that account for all accessibility needs in cases of emergency. So these are essential. They make sure that everyone who's attending a program can be safe during any kind of crisis or evacuation. This is part of the ADA, and then also under 504. This is something to consider, but really this is just best practice for everyone. Let's go to that next slide. Okay. So what does it really mean to make these individualized safety plans? Everyone here, if you're in a school, if you're in a school adjacent program, I'm sure you have already a pretty detailed safety plan in place. What to do in case of a fire, what to do in case of an earthquake, what to do in case there is someone who should not be on that campus, or someone who might be trying to harm young people, right? Some contingencies that we might not always think about, especially post-COVID, is what are we going to do if there's a contagious illness, right? What is the protocol that we have? So I really, really encourage everyone here to make sure that they are sitting down with the appropriate staff and they are planning out all of these emergency contingencies well before any summer events are happening, right? And while you're doing that, something that is often neglected in these plans, or it's added as like one or two sentences, which is to think about people with disabilities, right? We might immediately think, sure, if someone's using a wheelchair, then maybe we will need someone to be assigned to assist them in an emergency. Or we'll need to make sure that all of the exits are clearly marked and accessible at all times, right? But then I also want us to think about if there's a youth with a hearing disability, right? Is the alarm system only going to be an audio system, right? Fire alarms should have flashes as well, but that's not to say that every single fire alarm in every venue you're going to run into is set up to that. So how are you going to notify people if they're not able to hear the alarm and maybe they just see panic, right? Similarly, if someone has a visual disability. And then also think about disabilities that might affect behavior. And really this is going to be applicable to a wide range of students, maybe even some without diagnosed disabilities. But being in an emergency, it's incredibly stressful. All of your emotions are heightened. Your anxiety is incredibly heightened. If there's loud sounds going on, if there's flashing lights going on, even if someone might be somewhat trained or you've gone through sort of protocols about what to do, they might not be able to act in that moment. So if there is a fire, then who is going to be in charge of making sure that a specific groups of students is able to get to a safe place? Thinking about all of these things well beforehand and thinking about it per space is going to be really important, right? Because if you've got a program that's going to move you from space to space, you want to make sure that plan can either fit every room or you've got a room for every plan. This is also really important when we think about things like COVID, but really any kind of contagious illness, any sort of like really bad flu. There's usually a new version that crops up every year of some kind. So if someone is showing signs of infection or if they test positive for something, what's the protocol to keep them safe and also to keep everyone else who's attending safe? And we want to be really, really mindful of this because there are a lot of disabilities that are going to result in someone being immunocompromised. And so it might not be something where you are thinking about a lot of different ways to make things accessible, but that is one specific part of their disability. We want to make sure that we are highlighting that within safety plans, right? So it might be, and I feel like we're probably better about this just post-COVID in general, but we don't want to create a culture where we are asking young people or really any staff to push through an illness, to fight for it, to fight through it. Like, oh, well, you're coughing and you're sneezing, but it's just a low-grade fever, so you're fine to be there. Or someone who might really want to participate in an event, but you can tell that they are ill. We really want to make sure that we are prioritizing the safety of them and everyone around them. This can also be done just to make sure that medical supplies are accessible wherever you are. So EpiPens, defibrillators, and then also things like Narcan, right? We want to make sure that these sort of emergency supplies are available and that staff are actually trained in how to use these. All right, let's keep going. I don't see any questions, so I guess you guys are just soaking this all in. That's great. Another tip that we want to think of kind of before our event starts is communication with family and support networks. So when we're working with young people, we want to make sure that we have that open communication with their family, their loved ones, whoever is supporting them, right? We want to know what the accessibility needs for the youth are, but also what those needs are in communicating with families. And if we can be really transparent about this effort, we're going to strengthen that that bond that we have with these support networks, right? People are going to be able to trust us more, going to be able to give us more information. This is also part of the ADA, is to make sure that if we are communicating things with family members, we're doing it in an accessible way. And it's also under 504 as well. So let's talk about how we actually do that. Let's go to that next slide. Ooh, got a question. No, go for it. Advice for how to accommodate a student with a history of elopement or nonprofit and we receive federal funding through SCAC. Okay, no, that is a great one. We are going to talk a little bit about that, but if there is a young person that you're working with that has a history of immediately leaving the environment, right? As soon as they are unsupervised or as soon as they feel like they can, they're going to want to leave and go somewhere else, right? Obviously, the best thing to do is to make sure that we have appropriate staff who are going to be able to watch that young person, right? We don't want to make it so that there is someone constantly hovering over them so that maybe they feel a little alienated, maybe they feel a little singled out, they don't feel like they can engage with their other peers because they have someone constantly watching them. We want to make sure that we're still giving them enough space to have that experience. But the best thing would be to make sure that someone, that one of your staff kind of knows that that is a support need that that student has. And then in the case that someone does separate themselves from the group, they do separate themselves from the environment, you do want to make sure that you have staff who can immediately drop what they're doing and go and make sure that that student is safe. So generally when we structure our programs, we have a great amount of staff, and I know we're lucky in that regard, but we purposely stack it to where there are staff who don't have any other specific responsibilities other than support, right? So they are just there as ad hoc support to the facilitators and the existing structure we have, specifically so that if someone needs to leave, that person is going to be able to go with them, right? So honestly, staffing is going to be the easiest, or I'm not going to say easiest, but that's going to be the most straightforward solution for that. If staffing is not an option, then I would highly encourage you build that into those emergency plans, right? So what's going to happen if a student goes missing? Do you have those protocols already handy? Do you have a communication system so you can easily communicate with all staff, right? Do you know where if they've left this building, they can only go one of three ways, right? And that's also going to be part of this walkthrough. So all of these sort of come together to make sure we have this full plan. Is that helpful? Would it be inappropriate to ask that an aid be provided with a family? Does feel like it's our responsibility. The shorter answer is we really would want to try not to ask that of the family. Now, if it is the case that someone is using a personal care attendant as a support network, and that person is a family member, then that's that family and that individual's choice, right? We are always, I see another question, I want to get to that too. We are always advocating that when it does come to a personal care attendant, that it is not someone inside the family, that it usually is a professional that's hired by the family through an outside network of supports, just because we want to encourage a lot of independence and advocacy within that youth. And if you've got a family member, even if they're acting as support, it's really kind of hard to separate those two roles. So if your mom or your brother or your aunt is your PCA, then even if their main job is your PCA, part of them is always going to be that other role. So if someone's using a personal care attendant, we try and have that be outside the family. If it is just a matter of we think this or we know this person, the way their disability affects them is they're more than likely going to try and elope or leave a safe space. So we know that we're going to need to prepare for that contingency. I would really encourage you to try and make it so that you have staff available to help before we lean on the family. I know sometimes budgets are a constraint and sometimes the family is offering that as a support. And if the youth is in favor of that, then that is their decision. But we would try and rely on staff first if possible. Would we opt for video relay service or TTY in today's day and age? Hold on to that question. I think, oh, nope, we've got it right here. Great. You're absolutely right. TTY isn't really something that we're going to use. But video conferencing is still pretty accessible. And usually, even if you have to use a paid service, it's pretty affordable. There's also a lot of just video conference services that have accessibility features built in. And a lot of times, if you're working with families or consumers, while they usually really appreciate these sort of more professional services, a lot of times they can use just sort of native technology to be able to communicate through a traditional video conference system, so Teams or Zoom. Not the case for everyone, but a lot of people have kind of found workarounds from a consumer standpoint. Just to wrap up this point real quick, when we're thinking about communicating with families, we want to make sure we're providing multiple options, email, phone, and text. If the consumer uses video conferencing, especially if they have a preferred platform, then that's what we want to prefer. That's what we want to use. If someone is requiring or requesting a sign language interpreter, that we are providing that. Making sure we're providing information and documentation in someone's native language. And then also, if we can create reference sheets that are based in plain language, especially if we can use icons or pictures in some way, that's going to be a lot more accessible, especially if someone has ID or DD. But honestly, just creating a resource that's sort of a cumulative summary of maybe specific rules you have within a program or specific policies that you want to relay to a family. If you have those in an easy to read tip sheet, that's going to be more accessible for everyone. It's also really important as we do this beforehand to make sure we're gathering information specifically on accessibility, because it is so difficult when we work so hard to make sure things are accessible and we know exactly what we need to prepare for, and then bam, day one hits, and then we have someone coming who has a support need that we haven't prepared for. So making sure that we get all this information beforehand and make sure we are prompting for this information. As a point of experience, and I'm sure Michael can back me up, I would never rely on a family to volunteer, or a consumer or a young person to volunteer all the information they need. You are going to have to specifically ask what they need and give suggestions. Do you need this? Do you need that? Right? Because a lot of people either assume that you're going to provide things or don't realize what you need until you offer it. Okay, let's keep going. And Michael, jump in if I'm missing anything. I feel like we're doing good. Okay, talking about young people and families who use alternative communications. So accessible and alternative communication devices, any other kind of communication supports. We want to make sure that we have information on this and that we're honoring this as early and as fully as we can. This is also going to allow our participants to engage fully. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. And this is obviously covered under the ADA and Section 504. And honestly, I think pretty much all of the laws that might affect structuring these summer programs are going to reinforce that if someone's using an alternative communication device, that we're honoring that. Let's go to the next slide. So what does that actually mean? How can we use this? This is just where staff need to know about alternative communication styles, right? Alternative communication devices. I have on here that we need to train staff. That does not mean that every single staff necessarily needs to go through a very long and complex training. What this means is we need to make sure that everyone has a working knowledge. This also means that if we are providing communication, we've got visual schedules and we've got reference sheets that we're giving consumers. We want to make sure that if someone does not use verbal communication, that we have options for writing, that we have options for gesture-based communication, that we have simple communication boards that are printed and ready to use, and that we're honoring what youth are asking to use first. Let's keep going.
Can I jump in real quick, Troy? I just wanted to add to the accessible and alternative communication devices. You may have to encourage youth to use their devices. They may be used to environments where it sets them apart. And by being the leaders of the different groups that you have, you can set an example of that being the expectation that it's okay for them to use those devices. And that takes sometimes some patience, waiting for them to type in what they're going to say or select what they're going to say, and maybe some creativity if we're using some gestures as well. And Troy, I wanted to point out, Will asked, sorry if you said this, but do you have a template of an accessibility survey? I can jump in with a little bit on that. I know on our applications, we do request that people share any accommodations that they think they might need, and we clarify that that will not impact their ability to attend our programs. And then we also follow up either with an email or a phone call, depending on the individual and the program that we're doing, to get more clarification. So we'll double check the disabilities that they listed. If they did not give us the accommodations that we might expect to go with those, or if the accommodations are on there at all, we'll double check. We make sure we have the right supports for them.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent. And then last little tip for beforehand, and I know we've got a lot of good stuff, so I'm going to pick up the pace just a tiny bit. Language and representation. We want to make sure that the language you're using is respectful, that it's inclusive, and all the materials that you're giving out beforehand or at this initial part of the program, that it's language that's going to make everyone feel valued and everyone feel representative. And I'm sure if you guys have done other trainings in this series, you could probably say this stuff in your sleep by now because we hit on it every time. But we want to make sure that staff are trained on person-first language versus identity-first language, and that we're avoiding outdated and ableist terms. Let's go to that next slide just for some clarification. So this means that we know that we are saying a person with a visual disability, or if it is a person who prefers to be called blind because they see that as a part of their identity, that we are calling that person blind because that's what they've chosen, right? We are avoiding any kind of outdated or ableist terms. You may or may not be surprised at how often we see terms that are outdated and honestly offensive in some of our documents that we run across when working with other programs. So using the knowledge that you've kind of gained on these other trainings, we want to make sure we're updating our terms, and then also making sure that we are representing as many people as we can in the materials that we're creating. So even if we're talking about disability, are we talking about disability as a barrier? Is every time we're mentioning disability, it's don't worry if you have a disability, or even if you have a disability and things are tough, you can still do X, Y, Z, right? Are we constantly painting it in this negative language? Is it neutral, or is it maybe even a source of pride? And then as you are creating subject material for your camp or for your program, and maybe you're looking at works of artists to model or represent or discuss, are these artists people from the disability community? Are we able to really see young people's, are really able to create an experience where young people can see themselves represented in different ways? Because that's a really amazing opportunity that you guys have when you're working with young people. Let's go. Okay, so that's a bunch of stuff that we can kind of do before the event. Let's talk about your event as it's starting. All right. One of the things that we like to do is collaborative rules. And this is actually going to be a pretty big foundational piece. This is where you work together with youth to create expectations, right? You don't even have to call them rules. You can call them guides, expectations, whatever language you want to use. This ensures that everybody's voice is heard, and then it creates this idea of shared responsibility among the youth that you're working with. So it's less of a, these are the rules I impose on you, and more of a, these are the ones that we have created and agreed to together. So making sure that people can participate in activities is part of the ADA, but really just making sure that everyone feels they have an equal voice in decision making, that is disability etiquette. So let's talk about how we might actually do that on the next slide. Okay, this can be as simple as getting young people in a group and asking them, what rules do you think we should follow? If you haven't done this before, you would be surprised at how mature young people kind of instantly become when you give them that sort of collective responsibility. If you are facilitating this kind of discussion, we want to make sure that you've got visual supports. If you're asking youth to actually write out these rules, you want to make sure that you're giving them tools to do that. They're going to be accessible to them. This is a really good exercise to make sure we are encouraging agency. Again, it kind of fosters this community. Now, if you're hearing me and you're rolling your eyes or you're shaking your head, and I can't tell because I can't see any of you, perhaps you're all listening with rapt attention. But if you are thinking, wow, this is a wild idea, young people are just going to make up the rules they want and then there'll be chaos, this is why it's facilitated, right? So whenever I do this, I absolutely have a list of rules that we're going to land on, right? I already have that prepped in my mind. It's just a matter of making sure that they also hit those rules. And then if there's an extra rule that they don't have, like for instance, okay, we also need to make sure that we're staying together as a group. So if you're in classroom A and the lesson is for an hour, then you need to stay in that classroom for an hour, right? The rule is to stay in there. So you can also add to these rules as a facilitator. So please don't think this is just the Wild West and I'm asking you to hand over control. But when you do this, this is a lot easier to point back to rules and guidance and say, remember, we came up with these rules. We all agreed this is what would happen, or this is what we need to do. Let's keep going. Okay. As this program starts, and maybe a little bit before, we also want to make sure we are building in opportunities for peer leadership and peer mentorship. And I'm just curious, throw in the chat if you guys feel like you already have a good peer leader or peer mentor program baked into your existing classroom or program. And this is just where we assign senior members or returning attendees to be peer leaders. Maybe they're paired with one person in particular. Maybe they're just given a specific role at this program. And then what this really does is this helps new participants. So younger people, people who are their first time joining this program, it can be really isolating. It can be very intimidating. You don't really know anyone. So having someone kind of built in, and their role is, hey, your job is to make sure that everyone feels welcome. Your job is, if you see someone and they look a little stressed out and overwhelmed, that you go up to them, you say hi, you introduce yourself, right? There are a lot of young people who really have that skill and charm. I did not have that skill as a young person. I envied people who did. But I know it was really impactful whenever I was in an environment where I didn't feel that comfortable if someone else made that first step, especially if it was a peer. So why not build an avenue for that? As far as if we look at this through a disability etiquette lens, this is creating peer support without sort of the infantilizing layers that might come with it, right? So it's not a buddy system. It's not everybody hold hands, right? This is an organic system where young people can use their own skills to connect with other young people. Let's go to the next slide. So what this looks like, and Michael might want to jump in with some stuff, but I'm going to try and cover it. What this looks like is you're going to pair youth who have maybe similar backgrounds, similar aspirations, and similar disabilities with other youth who also have those same aspirations, backgrounds, or even disabilities. It's highly, highly advised that if you are selecting peer leaders, if you are giving peers additional responsibility, that they have a separate orientation or they have a separate training prior to the event or at the earliest stage of the event to make sure that their specific duties are clear. What this does is this encourages leadership, first of all. We're also going to see young people grow. We're going to see young people feel like they have more agency. And I'm really going to throw this one out here. You also want to make sure that you are emphasizing the expectations. If someone is a peer mentor or is a peer leader, we want to make sure that they know that their job is to be a leader and a mentor, not to find someone to date, or friendship is absolutely fine. But we want to make sure it's the kind of friendship where people build each other up and you have someone to look up to. Anything to add, Michael?
Yeah, I just want to add, a lot of people feel like they're in a box when it comes to pairing peer leaders that have similar disabilities. It depends on the group you're working with, right? So we're creating a group where anyone can join. If we have a peer leader who has autism and we have a new participant who has autism, like that's the perfect scenario, right? We can pair them up. They have similar experiences. They won't be exactly the same. But if you have a peer leader who has a disability and participants who are coming in with different disabilities, that can still be a great pairing or a group for a peer leader with a disability to support, even if it's different. So your peer leader has autism, someone comes in with a physical disability and uses a wheelchair. They both have faced barriers in their education, in being out in public and participating. And so there is still common ground for them to connect and work together to overcome those barriers moving forward. I also wanted to add too with the training with the South Carolina Youth Leadership Forum, we have the peer leaders get there later in the day after our professional staff get there. But you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can have a peer program throughout the year where you're building up peers. and you cycle through them. You could do a Zoom or Teams or Google Meet meeting with all of your peer leaders a week before the event where you go over the rules. The biggest thing is just making sure you have time to set very clear expectations for them and for them to ask potentially the same question multiple times, because a lot of them haven't been given the opportunity to be a leader yet, and they're going to want clarification on what exactly that means. So that's the best time to do that with them.
Thank you, Michael. Also, speaking of time, keep me honest on time too. Awesome. So when we talk about workplaces, or excuse me, workspaces, we want to make sure that we are offering accessible workspaces. So a variety of seating, a variety of workstations. We want to think about places that accommodate different mobility, sensory, or comfort needs. This is part of the ADA and 504 and a key part of disability etiquette as well. So let's talk about how to do that on the next slide. So this can be really as simple as providing different chair types, making sure that we are creating space for wheelchair users. I will also throw out the caveat that we want to make sure that we have that space before the wheelchair user comes into the space. While people might be very used to someone having to make a space for them, it makes a big difference if someone can easily come into a room and sit where they want without having to get someone else to create that space for them. Right? So think about if standing desks are going to be a resource that's appropriate for your space. Are there options for people to sit on the floor? Is the space not just about that physical seating, but also is it quiet enough? Are people going to be able to concentrate? Are they going to be able to play music that's going to keep them on task? Are they going to be able to wear noise canceling headphones to keep out noise? Are you creating a shared space for everyone, or are there going to be single seat options? Because we all know there's going to be some youth who really enjoy working in those groups or working with a partner. There's going to be some youth who would really rather not do that. They have their time for socialization, but when they want to focus, they want to focus individually. Think about the lighting as well. We want lighting to be kind of warm and soft, but we also need it to be appropriate if there's task lighting. We need it to be bright enough for someone who might have a disability that affects their vision. And then make sure that when we are thinking about these projects, are we giving everyone not just the tools they need, but the accessible tools they need? Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add with the quiet spaces, something that we have found very beneficial over the years is looking for a space where there is some extra space in the back in case someone needs to stretch or walk. That is very common. If the rooms don't accommodate that, where's the space they can go to step out? Do they need to talk to a staff member who just steps out in the hall? Isn't walking step for step with them, but here's the space that they could go to stretch or walk if they needed to. And then if possible, quiet rooms are best practice as well. So having a space where if they need a chance to cool off or de-stress or just sit in quiet for a little bit, where is that? And we want to establish that with everyone in the group so they know exactly where it is from the beginning.
Excellent. Let's go to this next one. Okay. Oh, and I see in the chat, do you have any specific recommendations for writing or art making tools? There's so many things online, it's difficult to know. Yeah, that's actually a great point. So we specifically have found that providing multiple options is going to be the best. We know that a lot of young people that we work with are going to gravitate towards the simplest objects. Markers, pencils, pens, paintbrushes, chalk, all of those things. But sometimes they need accessible scissors, right? So those are going to be scissors that don't actually have handles. They have kind of a loop that you go in. There's also going to be tools that you can set a pen, pencil, or marker in, and it sort of holds that, and then you hold that holder. Man, it really should have included a picture because that was a terrible description. But I would really say to try and ask young people what they already use. And honestly, if there is an artist that you are connected with, or if there's a local artist who might have a disability, or if you know someone in the community, talking to a person with a disability who creates art, they're really going to be one of the best resources to try and give you those things. Also, custom solutions are actually really popular. I mean, thank goodness for whoever invented the 3D printer. We've been able to create a lot of really cool assistive technology that way, almost on demand. They don't print out instantly. You got to have a day or two. But there are also some resources that might be able to help you create those custom solutions. So that one might be worth shooting us an email later on so we can do that one-on-one. Okay. Social event. Think about implementing a day one social event. This is just an organized, structured kind of social activity that help attendees bond, encourages relationship building, and reduces that first day anxiety. The ADA does require equal access to opportunities that includes social opportunities, so making sure it's accessible. Let's go to that next slide. So, and this is where I kind of have to rely on a lot of my staff to keep me honest, because I am one of those people, I'm a game person. I love games. I love board games. I love rules. I want to know how to win, right? Socialization is not always like that. But when we are creating sort of a social icebreaker event for people to get to know each other, we want to have a mix. We want to have something structured that people know how to participate in, because there are going to be young people who that's the best way to interact with people, when they know the rules and they know what to say. They know the game we're playing. They know the object of the game. But you also want to make sure that you are creating a space where people can just naturally mingle and talk to each other. Giving people matching cards, like, oh, find the person who has the blue card and say hi to them. Or, oh, you've got a question on your card. I wonder if someone else has the answer on their card. Finding a way to kind of get people to talk to each other. Be mindful if you're hosting an icebreaker game, that anxiety can be a big distraction. So having people go around the room and say a fun fact about themselves. If I ask everyone to do that right now, I guarantee you half of you would have spiked anxiety, because you'd just be waiting to think, what am I going to say on my turn? So we want to try and avoid those kind of icebreakers. But a party with a loosely structured activity, yeah, let's keep going.
One thought to add to that, Troy.
Yeah.
Staff and teachers, let's have them participate in those icebreakers too. It's a way to break down a little bit of the barriers, make people comfortable, and it's a way for your staff to make it easier for them to step in and support our nervous youth without it being awkward because they weren't participating and now they suddenly are, right? So we can naturally gravitate to individuals that need that support if we're already participating.
Perfect. Thank you. Relationship expectations. So we want to make sure that we are establishing clear expectations around relationships between attendees. This helps with safety, ideas of consent, and respect in social interactions. So let's go to this next section. Okay. When we are creating a program, and I know this is getting a little away from art accessibility per se, but really anytime you're working with young people in this kind of setting, especially if it's like an overnight setting or an extended setting, we want to make sure we're addressing this topic. So you want to make sure you can set clear, consistent, accessible, and repeated guidelines on appropriate behavior. That means you're going to have to define appropriate behavior. Do not leave it open. Do not say, be respectful. Do not say be appropriate. You're going to have to specifically say, do not touch other people unless they specifically give you permission to, or just do not touch other people. Do not touch things that do not belong to you unless you are specifically asked. This is also a really good opportunity to educate on the idea of consent in a very general sense, right? So we respect people's boundaries, and people are able to make their own boundaries, right? People deserve to be called the name they want to be called. People deserve to have their property respected. And also, if you are borrowing a space, this space deserves to be respected. This space, this equipment that we're borrowing deserves to be respected. You also want to, all of these other tips that we're talking about, create a bonded learning community, right? When staff are involved, when youth feel safe, when there's collective ownership, when they are able to have agency, they're going to be more open and honest with you. And so you do want to be able to create a space where people can have these kind of frank, difficult conversations. And when we're thinking about the kind of relationships that youth have, we also want to balance the ability for people to socialize, the ability for people to meet other young people, to connect in a safe space. So, for instance, at our summer program, we do not have a specific rule against dating, except for if someone is a peer staff, they cannot date someone, right? Because that is not their role at this camp or at this program. But we don't want to specifically create an environment where no one feels like they're able to create that sort of bond. Because frankly, when it comes to young people with disabilities, they're given limited opportunities, right? People without disabilities might be able to have all of these really organic spaces to connect with other people. People with disabilities don't always get the same number of opportunities, right? So we really want to be mindful where we are creating a safe space where everyone has all of their boundaries respected, and that you're able to have a successful program that's focused on what you need it to be focused on, while also allowing people to build those connections. Also be sure if you are creating rules, you can create rules based on age or on the specific role they have. Do not create rules based on what someone's disability is or isn't. Don't say if someone has an intellectual disability that they can't date, but everyone else can, right? We want to make sure we're avoiding that. Okay, let's keep going. Throughout your event, and we're gonna kind of speed through these. I think we got like 10 minutes if we can leave time for questions. So, and Mr. Michael actually already touched on this one, creating a quiet space, right? Making sure that you have a designated quiet zone for attendees who need a break from noise and activity, individuals who have disabilities that result in them feeling overstimulated, heightened anxiety, overstimulated through different senses. This kind of quiet space is going to be really, really important as part of the ADA and 504. So let's talk about how to make it. Okay, all this is creating a low stimulation zone. We want comfortable furniture. We want soft lighting that's still accessible. We want comfortable seating that is not too stimulating for someone who is very sensitive, especially to tactile sensations or fabrics, right? So we want comfortable, but not like fuzzy or inflatable furniture. You want to give agency for youth to be able to use this space as they need it, while also setting up clear guidelines. So there are going to be youth who, if you set up this space where it's like, okay, you can go to this space, you're only going to be loosely supervised, right? There'll just kind of be someone there nearby. You can relax, and then when you feel better, you can come join the group. It's going to be young people who decide that that's where they spend the entire length of their program. So making sure we are saying like, okay, do you feel like you need to go there for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for the next hour or so? When are you going to come back, right? And making sure that people are using this specifically as a quiet space for them to collect themselves. Noise canceling headphones can also be a big part of this. Let's go to the next one, and Michael, you go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so Karen asked a question, are there best practices for a quiet space? Is another classroom okay? In general, the more comfortable we can make it, the better. If all you have is classrooms, then a separate classroom is great. We want to make sure we're providing some things that make it a little more comfortable. If we can dim the lighting, like blankets make everything more comfortable, right? If you have a couple extra ones, noise canceling headphones. Also, quiet spaces come in lots of different forms. If you can see into the quiet space from the main room, you may not need a staff member to hang out in there, but Karen asking a question, the question I'm answering right now. It is since we're dealing with youth, we want to make sure that we have staff who are there to make sure it is still a safe space. We do want to remind staff though, that it is a quiet space. So if they're checking in with someone because they said they wanted to take 10 minutes, they're going to do that really quietly with just that individual. But usually if someone's in that quiet space, we have a staff member nearby or in that space as well to help support.
Yeah, perfectly said. Usually it's like staff member has a line of sight and they're in earshot. They don't have to be physically in that space. Or they can be, but they're not really there to interact with the youth unless that's something they want. Group self-portraits. This is another activity that you can do sort of throughout your program. You can encourage youth to create a collaborative self-portrait with other people or just a self-portrait of themselves or like a vision board style activity. This is going to promote self-expression, fostering this idea of disability pride is one of the main reasons we use it. And then also if this is in a group, you start to create this community identity. Let's keep going. So when we have used self-portraits as an activity before, we sort of guide this as a discussion on representation of personal strengths, but also other aspects of yourself, right? I am the person who has traditional art skills are just, they're not my forte, right? I can make a mean stick figure, but that's about it, right? So we want to make sure that youth feel empowered to be able to create this in the way that's going to be in line with their abilities, right? I've seen some incredibly ornate ones. I've seen some that are really basic, but they hold a lot of depth and meaning. So one of the ways that we facilitate this activity is we actually show a lot of famous self-portraits. We have people guess what they are or who they are. We talk a little bit about the history of them. We focus on a lot of artists with disability and then also sort of challenge youth to find within the self-portrait, can you see reflections of that person's self-identity and aspects of their disability within this portrait? And then asking youth to do the same. Experiment with representation, right? If this is, I wouldn't really recommend this if you're trying to teach a very specific technical skill, but if you're more about exploring the format or you're just kind of getting people to experiment, experiment with representation. Show me the things you like. Show me the things you're interested in. Show me the things you're passionate about. Show me the things you think about yourself when you think of yourself. And see if you can show that in a self-portrait. We've also done this with a group, which is really interesting to have a group of people have to come together to make a collaborative self-portrait. A lot of times, if you're using a system where youth are going to be spending time with the same small cohort throughout the program, this is a really good way to kick things off. Also, might be good to visit this at the end of the program and see if people want to make adjustments to it. Let's go to the next one. Encouraging independence. So this is just one that we do throughout. Again, if you've been part of our other trainings, you hear this all the time. We want to make sure we're allowing young people to make choices about the activities they do, about the seating they do, and if they can, the schedule that they do. This is really going to build self-advocacy and kind of contribute to this sense of empowerment. We want to make sure we're following the ADA guidelines for reasonable modifications that encourage independence. So let's talk about how we do that on the next slide. This can be as simple as offering different activities, right? If they're in a space and they can do 1 of 5 activities, or if they are in a space, you're going to be in this space for 2 days, I need you to do these 3 activities. You can do them in whatever order you want. Provide decision-making support. So we want to encourage people to make these decisions independently. But maybe they'd like to talk with a peer. Maybe they'd like to talk with a staff before they make these kind of decisions. Really, any way that you can encourage a self-directed participation. We want to bake that throughout all of your programs, right? This idea of agency, especially for young people with disabilities, can be a little foreign. People fall into these traps of learned helplessness. We have young people who come from families where they're sort of constantly infantilized. They're constantly told that, you know, I'm sure if we had more time, I would have heard it in the icebreaker that, oh, my youth has the mind of a child. They're 16 years old, but they're emotionally 2. They're emotionally 12, right? We want to make sure that we are creating a space where people can be independent and practice making choices, because that is how people grow. And also making sure we're embracing the dignity of risk. And that means letting people fail, letting people make mistakes, letting people make choices, and they don't like the consequences of them, right? We have to do that because that is how people learn. I have never learned an important lesson because I made all the right choices the first time, right? We learn best through failure. Give young people a safe space to do that too. Let's go. A little bit about handling conflict. We want to make sure we're teaching de-escalation and conflict resolution strategies to support that safe environment. Let's go to how we do it. Make sure that staff understand the power of active listening. If you do any motivational interview training, this can be really powerful too. Peer staff and full staff, but also peer staff should be trained on how to see conflict before it happens and jump into it. If you see two young people and things are getting heated, that's the perfect opportunity for peer staff to come in and diffuse things, move one person away from the other, right? Making sure we're basing things around motivational techniques. We're talking about stress management. We're talking about self-management. We're modeling that. We're saying it out loud. And also rely on youth to be the experts on themselves, right? They know like, oh, sorry, I'm getting really heated. Can I go sit in that cool down space for a minute? And last one, I think.
Can I add
Yeah,
to that real quick, Troy?
please.
I always like to tell a super quick story because we're trying to get to questions when it comes to addressing infractions. I was working with a middle school at one point, and I had all the students introducing themselves, and I had one student who raised his hand and said, "Hi, my name is blank. I'm the bad kid." So I looked at him and said, "Are you really the bad kid? Or have people told you you're the bad kid?" And they're like, "Well, everyone tells me I'm a bad kid. I'm always in trouble." I said, "Okay. Um, let's talk in just a second." I went through everyone else's introductions. I sat, and after I got everyone started an activity, I sat down and I said, "Hey, um, if I ask you to help me out, would you be able to help me pass things out nicely? Also, why do people say you're the bad kid? Oh, it's because like you like to give answers, you have trouble waiting. Well, what can we do for you to give me a sign that you want to give me an answer or a sign that you need to take a break?" After about a year of working with a student, a new staff came in and they introduced themselves and they said, "Hi, my name is blank, and these are the things I need to work my best," word for word in middle school, which is awesome. So when we address the infractions, giving students a chance to learn and express their needs from that. Karina, uh, motivational interviewing is a technique of essentially guiding a conversation towards positive outcomes. There are a ton of really great resources out there on the basics of motivational interviewing, but the goal essentially is to recognize the feeling underneath what someone's saying and allowing them to say it in their own words and then working with them towards a solution. So that might be giving a couple of options instead of just leaving it open-ended, but recognizing that the feelings exist, what we do about them is important. How can we get to a positive thing that we've done?
That was so much better than what I was trying to type in the chat. Thank you. Yeah. And you don't have to be an expert in these, but it's good to have sort of a foundational understanding of them to guide your conversation. And when it comes to addressing infractions, this will be our last point. We want to make sure we're coming at things from kind of a restorative approach, but we're also reinforcing rules. When we address infractions in this really consistent manner, this creates accountability. This puts trust in the conflict resolution process. And then we're focused more on providing support than we are on doling out punishment. So part of the ADA is making sure that we are ensuring behavioral support accommodations. And the idea is founded on these positive behavioral interventions. So let's talk about how we do them. So this is why I like to start off with this collaborative rule building, right? We want to make sure that we are consistent, that we are neutral, and that we are transparent. Nobody is getting treated differently. Everyone is following the exact same rules. And if young people have a hand in creating these rules, that also helps with buy-in. We also try and provide these rules as early as possible. So yes, in some cases, it's a matter of creating these rules as program starts. For some programs, we send out rules in advance. We send out the full rules. We send out a plain language version of rules that explains exactly what they are. And then we have a small session where everyone signs these rules. We go over one by one, and everyone has signed it saying this is what they agreed to do. We want to rely on that peer mediation. So if there's a young person who has already created a bond who can kind of step in prior to anything being escalated, that's going to be great. Also creating these individualized support plans. So in school, you've got your IEP. You're not really going to have that in a lot of summer programs, although those accommodations still follow through. But we want to make sure that we know what young people specifically need, and we're trying to provide that as early and often as possible. And if we do that really effectively, we should not see a lot of rule infractions. But we also want to be mindful of how disability might affect behavior for youth. So we know that there are some youth who rules don't always mean the exact same thing, right? We want to make sure rules are interpreted in exactly the way that we intend them to be. So don't write them in a vague way. Be very clear and give very specific examples. So if someone really needs very literal instructions, it is there from the get-go, right? We also know that rules and punishment don't always work for every single youth. There are some youth where their disabilities affects them to where that sort of system is not as impactful to them. So think about things like token economies for a reward system. Think about asking people to try out these supports that you've created, this peer mentorship, this safe space, before we get to a point where we're looking at anyone breaking rules. Okay, we have talked a lot. Let's go to questions. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, maybe. And Annie, if you can go to 63, I think.
And while Annie's skipping ahead, we're going to do those case studies during the talkback section tomorrow. So if you want to join us then, we can go through our case studies and also any examples y'all have.
Any lingering questions?
Okay, I'm assuming everyone's typing furiously for their questions, Troy. I just wanted to add that while we're trying to make the most accessible space, it doesn't mean that you have to be perfect. Often, like Troy said in the beginning, we'll have youth who show up and we've done the outreach to check on accommodations and they need an accommodation they didn't tell us about. So what we typically do is work to make the day as accessible as possible and then work with them to get the supplies we need for that next day. Making sure that we're adapting. If we encounter something after we did our walkthroughs that wasn't identified, how can we adjust? Can we reach out to a local Center for Independent Living or an assistive technology resource to get something quickly? And moving forward with that, because we're all very different. We all have very different needs. It's impossible to predict everything, so we just work on implementing as many as we can from the beginning.
Well, Michael, I'm not even going to try and top that. That was perfect. So, Amanda, pass it off to you.
Thank you both. This was wonderful, so clear, and some really great things for people to think about, and some action items for people to start implementing now. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Again, I just invite everyone to join the webinar reflection hour tomorrow from 3 to 4. It's really an open time to continue this conversation. It's going to be lots of space for questions, and we'll look forward to hearing about those case studies as well. So tomorrow, if you're available, join us again on Zoom. There's a registration link available on our website. And then for those of you who are not able to join tomorrow, we hope to see you at our next webinar on March 5th. where we will talk about some more discipline-specific ways to provide accessibility. So we look forward to seeing you in the coming days or next month. Thank you, everyone. And there is a short survey you could take there for us. That would be wonderful as well. And please enjoy your evening.
Great job, guys. Really, really strong.
Thank you for having us. This has been great.
Yeah, we love the